Hello to everybody, I'm Marco Beato, Associate Professor in Sport and Exercise Science at University of Suffolk. Today we will have the opportunity to listen to Kevin De Keijzer that will present on our channel Understanding Sports Science this presentation titled Perception and Application of Flywheel Training by Professional Soccer Practitioners. Thank you, Kevin, for your time. I would like to add that Kevin is doing a PhD on flywheel training and is collaborating with me at the University of Suffolk. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Marco. Just like to briefly add that this paper is available online and it is open access. So if anyone would like to access it, please feel free to look for it online. Before anything else, it's probably best that we just discuss briefly what flywheel training actually is. Flywheel training is a resistance training method that was initially developed to be utilized in space and has found more recently application in both health and sporting environments. Here on the left, we can have a very brief description of what the concentric and eccentric phase of flywheel training looks like. So as we can see, both movement and force go in the same direction during the concentric phase, whereas during the eccentric phase, movement comes in the same direction that it came from, and force continues to go in the same direction. So they go in opposite directions. And what this means from a repetition perspective in terms of concentric and eccentric outputs, we can see here in the figure in the middle how they differ between concentric and eccentric phases. And as we can see here, there seems to be an eccentric overload. And so this can be achieved with certain factors such as appropriate technique and certain devices being used. Nonetheless, it's interesting to consider that you can achieve an eccentric overload if certain factors are obtained. On the right here, we have a schematic representation of a flywheel leg press, which may look slightly different to a traditional resistance training leg press or a weight stack machine used in the gym. And although it looks different to, say, for example, the movement that's being displayed on the left, it has the same concept and uses the same principles. And we can say the same for these machines. Although they may look slightly different, one from another, they all are based on the same principle of the flywheel. Here, to try and give a better understanding of what the flywheel movement looks like, we can see a soccer athlete performing a flywheel squat, attempting to decelerate the movement at the end. This is hopefully to try and achieve an eccentric overload. On the left here, we can see some of the functions and attachments of the flywheel device with their own descriptions. So now that we've discussed a little bit what flywheel training is, we'd like to highlight what it's for. As with many resistance training methods, flywheel training is utilized in sport to try and enhance sport performance. Specifically, we try to improve change of direction ability and jumping ability. But as practitioners, we need to also try and improve other factors such as strength and power. Ultimately, one of our objectives is also to try and reduce the likelihood of injuries occurring, specifically musculoskeletal injuries. The flywheel is shown to be applied and researched for all of these factors. So now we've gone over a little bit of what the flywheel training is and what it's applied for. I'd like to discuss our methods for this investigation and our aims and purpose. So we surveyed 51 professional soccer practitioners from around Europe to try and understand their perspectives and how they applied flywheel training. It was also of interest to try and understand what they viewed as limitations of both the literature and how flywheel training is currently applied. One of the first questions that we asked practitioners was whether or not they believed familiarization to be necessary. As we can see here on the left, majority of practitioners agreed that flywheel training necessitates, or effective implementation of flywheel training necessitates, familiarization. But it's interesting to see with one of our follow-up questions that familiarization differed from practitioner to practitioner. And although a majority of practitioners prescribed 2 to 3 sessions to familiarize athletes, some practitioners prescribed 1 session, while some prescribed 4. It's also interesting to see that although there isn't a lot of literature to support the use of player-dependent familiarization, some practitioners also utilize this technique. The next questions that we asked about flywheel training was how it was applied. Initially, we asked practitioners how frequently they applied flywheel training and broke this down into 2 different phases, the preseason and the in-season period. So initially, during the preseason period, practitioners seemed to be applying flywheel training between 2 to 3 sessions per week. And during the in-season period, they reduced this to 1 to 2 sessions per week. This is also in line with the literature, which typically sees a reduction in both resistance training and plyometric and physical training to then focus more on tactical and technical training, as well as recovery, because games do come thick and fast during the in-season period. The next question we asked practitioners was which exercise they selected most often, or which one they used most often within the programs. And it wasn't surprising, given that majority of the literature consists of squats, to see that the squat was also king in application, with a whopping 40 out of 51 practitioners reporting that they utilized the squat. 30 practitioners also stated that they utilized a lunge or acceleration movement, while 20 practitioners reported using the lift and hinge movements, such as the deadlift, and 19 practitioners reported using open kinetic chain exercises, such as the leg curl or knee extension. As we can see here in the two figures on the left, a variety of exercises can be performed with the flywheel. And this obviously depends on the type of flywheel that we have. So here we can see that there are conical pulleys. We can also see that there are horizontal cylindrical discs, which may differ in its style and function, but allow athletes to perform a variety of movements. It's important to consider that the differences between devices can also guarantee or can also mean that certain outcomes may or may not be obtained. Specifically, one aspect that's very important to flywheel training, according to practitioners, is the ability to achieve an eccentric overload. This was another question that we asked, and it seems that practitioners, although they value this, they can apply training in many different ways. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only thing that's important, but it's a very important aspect of flywheel training. The next bit that we went on to was to try and compare practitioner beliefs and current evidence in soccer. As we can see here, the ability to improve change of direction performance with flywheel training was supported by a majority of practitioners, which is in line with the current evidence. Similarly, practitioners believe that flywheel training can enhance jumping performance, which is also in line with the evidence. And although we see a similar amount of practitioners describing their confidence in the application of flywheel training for enhancing sprint performance, the evidence does not seem as clear at the moment. This doesn't mean that flywheel training isn't effective for sprint performance or enhancing sprint performance, but rather that at the moment, the literature isn't as clear as the literature for change of direction and jumping performance with soccer players. A similar story seems to be the case for strength, whereby a majority of practitioners support the use of flywheel training. And this practitioner belief, is also supported by the evidence in the literature within both soccer and athletic populations. In terms of injury prevention, a majority of practitioners once again believe that flywheel training could be effective for reducing the likelihood of injuries, but the evidence does not seem as clear at the moment in terms of this. For acutely enhancing performance through the use of post-activation performance enhancement protocols, a majority of practitioners also believe that the flywheel device can be utilized within these protocols, with the evidence at the moment suggesting that acute performance can be enhanced. Finally, one other question that we asked practitioners was whether or not they believe that traditional resistance training and flywheel resistance training are equivalent or superior to one another. So when we asked practitioners whether or not they believed flywheel training was superior for eccentric overload, practitioners responded suggesting that the majority of them were, which is also in line with the evidence. As we can see here, in terms of injury prevention and strength, the majority of practitioners remained unsure whether or not flywheel training was superior to or equivalent to traditional resistance training, which once again is in line with the current evidence landscape. In terms of our investigation, we also tried to highlight possible future directions and investigations which might be worthy. The first of which was more comparisons between traditional resistance training and flywheel training to try and understand the differences between the two, and also understand what outcomes may be possible with one or the other, or possibly both. The second of which was more investigations determining the effectiveness or efficacy of flywheel training for reducing injury likelihood. This is an important aspect of the literature that currently remains relatively untouched. And the final and most important, possibly, recommendation that we could make for future directions is to investigate the practicality and application of flywheel training, and also to develop evidence-based guidelines. These can involve recommendations for volume, intensity, or inertial load, as well as training frequency with a variety of athletes, but specifically female soccer players, and elite level male players. I obviously can't complete this presentation without thanking my two supervisors for my PhD, Dr. Stuart McErlain-Naylor and Dr. Marco Beato. If you're interested in any of our literature or any of the literature that we've researched, please feel free to click on the link to go to our project on ResearchGate, where we have all of our papers available, but you might also be able to find other relevant rich literature on flywheel devices. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think has been very, very clear, and thank you for obviously showing our project on ResearchGate, and this is for sure a very good link for practitioners and people that are interested in what we are doing. So I have 3 questions for you, and I hope you can clarify my doubts. So the first point is, based on your experience, what is the right flywheel training frequency that we should suggest or schedule anyway per week in season in football? Or what is your suggestion based on your experience?
Yeah, I think based on my experience, 1 session is more than enough to induce improvements. Although if possible, it'd be good to do 2 sessions a week, whereby 1 session is focused more on strength development, where we incur a little bit more muscle damage. And we also possibly use higher inertial loads to try and focus on strength. Whereas the 2nd session, we can focus on accessory movements, maybe possibly do some rotational movements, or maybe even use lighter inertias to specifically focus on trying to reduce the likelihood of injury. So maybe targeting the hamstrings once again, and giving the hamstrings 2 specific flywheel sessions during the week. But if possible, 2. If not, then just 1 strength training session a week is probably sufficient.
Thank you very much. Based on as a follow-up of that, of this question, what do you think about microdoses? If a practitioner doesn't have the time for a 2nd session, does it make sense for you to have a microdose of a flywheel training, maybe closer to the match day? We suppose that we do the 1st session 3 or 4 days before the match. Does make sense for the practitioner to have another small dose a couple of days before the match? What is your opinion about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think once you familiarize the participants, once they're confident in the execution of the movements, you can use lighter inertias to try and achieve a higher power output and try and focus a little bit more on power. But that stimulus, if applied consistently, especially during the season where typically we focus on recovery, we focus on tactical training, we do lose some physical elements. We do lose sprint, we do lose jump ability. And so even trying to microdose, as you mentioned, during the week is probably going to be effective over a month's period. To try and maintain, probably not improve, but certainly maintain physical performance, which over a long season can be very, very important. In terms of application, possibly you could utilize the day of the match with people who haven't started the game. So if somebody hasn't taken part in the game, to try and induce some more stress to the muscles, you could utilize your typical aerobic or anaerobic running that you'd perform after the game. But you could also add, due to the portability of the flywheel, some strength training for the people who didn't take part. And that could be an additional stress to consider, an additional stress to try and encourage adaptation and growth with people who didn't take part in the game.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for this answer. The last one is related to practitioner belief in sprinting improvements after a flywheel training. So obviously we have evidence, and also the practitioner believe in the right thing when we talk about change of direction improvements, jumping improvements. But can you clarify a bit why we have this situation when we talk about sprinting performance? Can flywheel improve sprinting performance? Do we have enough evidence to say that, or for the moment we should wait before to obviously have a statement or believe in that? Or what is your opinion?
Yeah, I guess there's 2 things that I'd like to touch on there. In terms of confidence within the literature, something that maybe practitioners are confident in, but the evidence isn't there yet, is injury prevention or reduction of injuries. So at the moment, there aren't many investigations that actually looked at effectiveness or the efficacy of flywheel training for reducing injury likelihood. but practitioners are very confident in that. So that's something definitely that we need more investigations in. In terms of sprinting performance, I think it's a bit of a paradox, because with training, we have less and less time. We want more and more. So we want to see bigger improvements in less time. And so how a lot of the protocols, how some of our protocols as well have been applied in the literature and in practice is, oh, we'll do 1 session a week and we'll try to see improvements. Realistically, we know that we probably need a little bit more of a greater frequency. And so there are a variety of protocols, some applying training once a week using, for example, a lateral squat, that haven't seen improvements in sprint performance. Whereas there are other protocols that have utilized a leg press 2 to 3 times per week with elite level handball players and have seen improvements in sprint performance. And so I think more than anything, the reason why the evidence is unclear at the moment is because there's a large variation in application, both from an exercise selection perspective, but also a training frequency perspective. And so it's important that we be honest and fair and probably state that 1 training session per week is sufficient during the in-season period to maintain physical performance from a sprinting perspective, but it may not always be effective for improving sprint performance. If you're looking for improvements in sprint performance, the literature at the moment probably recommend at least 2 sessions or maybe even 3 sessions, with a lot of the protocols that have utilized only 1 session not being very effective.
Thank you, Kevin. Honestly, your presentation has been very clear. So I take the opportunity to thank you for the time to be part of our channel, Understanding Sports Science. And I'm sure that many people will comment your presentation and probably will contact you for further clarification. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco.